Welcome to our 10th and final lecture for the Pentateuch. Today's lecture will be over the book of Deuteronomy. We believe that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy except for probably chapter 34, which was most likely written by Joshua. The theme of the book of Deuteronomy is the Lord prepares the people of Israel for the entering of Canaan. The title of the book, Deuteronomy, comes from the Septuagint title, meaning Second Law. Let's begin by discussing reasons why Moses restated the law on the border of Canaan. Number one, there was a new generation that God was working through, since the old generation, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua, had perished in the wilderness. The new generation needed to hear the law again, and for some, for the first time. Secondly, there was a new challenge. For 40 years, the children of Israel had wandered in the wilderness, and now they were finally entering the Promised Land. However, there would be a whole new set of battles to fight, and they needed to be prepared. Thirdly, there was a new leader. Moses was going to die, and Joshua, a servant of Moses, was going to take over the leadership. Moses knew the success of the nation depended on the people obeying God, and he knew this from first-hand experience, as we have discussed in detail throughout our study. Therefore, they needed to follow this new leader as he followed the Lord. And fourthly and lastly, there would be new temptations. This new generation, under new leadership, with new challenges in the new land, would have an entirely new set of problems to face than during the 40-year wilderness journey. So, they needed to be prepared. Roman numeral 1, the history of the Exodus. Letter A, Moses reviews with the people what they have gone through. Chapter 1 of Deuteronomy is a retelling of what happened from Horeb or Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, including the setting up of leaders, the complaining of the people, the rebellion against Moses, and the defeat of different enemies. Then chapter 2 is about the wandering in the wilderness and the enemies they faced there. And finally, chapter 3 is about the journey from the wilderness back toward Canaan and Joshua's selection and anointing as their leader. Letter B. Moses commands Israel to obey the statutes and not become idolatrous. Moses told them not to add to or take away from any of the laws that they had been given, and reminded them of the harsh punishments that they faced in Numbers 25 when they fell into Moabite idolatry and fornication. Then he tells them to teach the commandments to their children and their grandchildren. Finally, he reminded them of how he would not be able to enter into Canaan because of his disobedience. And this was done as a way to warn them of the same punishment if they disobeyed the Lord. Roman numeral 2. The law is restated to the next generation. Letter A. The 10 Commandments are reiterated. Moses had to reiterate the 10 Commandments because most of the people were either too young or not alive when they were first delivered. Now, interestingly, it's not even called the 10 Commandments until Deuteronomy chapter 10. Letter B. Israel is charged to love the Lord and not forget him. Moses said that all the law hinges upon loving the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. The law should be taught to their children and grandchildren and posted everywhere they looked. And then, when their children and grandchildren asked about the statutes, they were to remind them of all the Lord did in Egypt and afterwards. Letter C. Israel is told to utterly destroy all the nations of Canaan, and God will bless them. The Lord tells them that He will allow them to overthrow 7 nations mightier than they when they enter the land. However, when they get there, they are to kill all the fighting men, destroy their altars and idols, and not allow their children to marry any of the people they overtake. If they do this, then the Lord will bless them, and they will not fall into idolatry. Unfortunately, Joshua did not complete this mission, and that did allow idolatry to creep into Israel. Letter D. Israel is warned not to forget God when they enter the land. Now, this included them not forgetting the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Some of the things the Lord reiterated were that they were fed with manna and quail, their feet never swelled, and their clothes never wore out. And they needed to remember that this was all done as a loving act, like a father toward his son. All that they will get when they enter into Canaan will be because of the Lord. Letter E. Moses reminds Israel of their past rebellions. The same day that this was all being read was the same day that they would enter the land. But they needed to remember that God would take them into the land of giants. However, they would not receive victory because of their righteousness, but because of God's, since they rebelled against the Lord and were a stubborn people. Then the Lord reminded them how they provoked him right after they left Egypt. Then, at Mount Horeb or Sinai, when the Lord almost killed them all and started over with Moses because of their calf worship. Then at other various places when they complained about food and water. And finally, when they did not trust the Lord and feared the giants in the land, which resulted in the 40 years of wandering. Letter F. Moses tells the people how he got the second pair of tables and placed them in the ark. The Lord made Moses cut the tablets out, which here are finally called the 10 Commandments. But then the Lord wrote on them. This was because Moses broke the first set out of anger. He then ends this chapter reminding them that they went into Egypt with 70 people over 400 years ago, but they came out with as many as the stars of the sky. Letter G. Israel is ordered to keep God's commandments and promise rewards for it. Moses starts off by reminding them of the people that were swallowed up by the earth when they rebelled against him, and says that if they obey the Lord, then they will see longer life than he. In other words, obedience gives life, but disobedience would bring death. Letter H. Moses gives Israel their orders for taking over the land and establishment of offerings. They are to utterly destroy their places of idolatry. Then they will establish their place of worship and begin the sacrifices to the Lord. Letter I. Israel is warned of false prophets. In chapter 13, the Lord says that anyone who says to worship any other god, whether it's a prophet or even a family member, that person should be put to death. Letter J. Moses details what meat is clean and unclean, and the tithe is explained. Now, all of this is the same as listed in Leviticus. However, for the tithe, we find out that 1/10 of all of one's increase was to be brought to the Lord, and it was to be used for the Levites, the immigrants, the fatherless, and the widows. Then letter K, the 7th year debt forgiveness, also known as the year of Jubilee, is defined. Here, we find out that all debts to fellow Jews should be forgiven, but if it is a foreigner's debt, then that debt can still be collected afterwards. Letter L. All men are required to attend 3 solemn feasts each year. The first feast is known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, also known as the Passover. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was to be observed the same day each year for 7 days, and no leaven was allowed to be in anything for the entirety of the holiday. The second feast would be known as the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost. The Feast of Weeks was 7 weeks after the Passover, and it was to be observed for 7 days. And finally, the Feast of Tabernacles. This 8-day feast was to commemorate the Exodus out of Egypt. Letter M. The punishment for idolatry is explained. The individual who commits idolatry was to be stoned at the gates until they died. However, there must be 2 or 3 witnesses, or the person must be released. Then letter N, the promise of a future king is given. At the end, the Lord promises to give them a king after they have entered the promised land. The king would not be allowed to multiply horses, not be allowed to multiply wives, and would not be allowed to multiply silver and gold. In fact, the king would also be responsible for making a copy of the law in front of the priests. Letter O. The priest's duties are listed. The priests are not to be given land because their inheritance will come from the Lord, and their food shall come from the sacrifices. Then there is a prophecy that the Lord will rear up a prophet, which most theologians interpret to be a reference to Jesus Christ himself. Then letter P. 3 more cities of refuge are established. The first 3 were mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 4. And these will be places that offenders could flee in order to receive a fair trial. Letter Q. Israel is given the rules of war for conquering the land. Israel was told not to be afraid of the enemy when they went into battle, because the Lord was with them. And the priest's job was to encourage the people prior to going into battle in order to remind them that the Lord was on their side. The officers were then to remind any soldier that had just bought a home or planted a vineyard or just gotten married to not go into battle until all their affairs were taken care of. When the people got into battle, all the men were to be killed, but not the women, children, or animals. They were to be considered the spoils of war to go to the people. Finally, Moses ends this chapter by giving a list of nations who were to be utterly destroyed: the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Everyone was to be killed because of their wickedness. Letter R. Various laws are presented. Number 1. Laws for unsolved murders are detailed. If a body is found and there is no knowledge of the murder, then the city closest to the body would be required to offer a heifer as a sacrifice. The heifer was supposed to be beheaded, and the elders of the city would wash their hands over the heifer. Secondly, laws concerning rebellious children are presented. If a child would absolutely not obey their parents, then he or she was to be brought to the elders and stoned to death. Most theologians believe this is probably talking about a much older child because the illustration of a glutton and a drunkard is given here in this passage. The chapter also ends by saying that if a person commits a sin worthy of death and is hanged on a tree, then he is to be taken down the same day because he is accursed by God. Thirdly, laws concerning sexual sins and their penalties are explained. If a woman claimed to be a virgin in order to be married, but then it was discovered that she wasn't, she was to be stoned to death. Also, both parties who committed adultery were to be put to death, although it is not prescribed exactly how. Then, if one is betrothed or engaged to another, but cheats on him or her, then both the one engaged and the cheater are to be stoned to death. Next, a person who forces another to have sex should be put to death alone, since the one forced is innocent. And finally, if two people are single but caught having the act of sex, then the man is required to pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver and marry her. Fourthly, those who cannot hold official offices are listed. In Deuteronomy 23, the phrase is translated, "They cannot enter into the congregation or assembly of the Lord." This phrase most likely refers to official public offices of leadership in Israel. These people included eunuchs, bastard children to the 10th generation, and Ammonites or Moabites to the 10th generation because of what they did with Balaam. Number 5, laws concerning divorce and slavery are given. People were allowed to get divorced even if they were just not happy with each other anymore. But if one got remarried and then divorced again, the original couple could not remarry each other. In the New Testament, Jesus said that this was only allowed because of the hardness of their hearts. And then he stated that the only allowable reason for divorce in God's eyes was infidelity. And finally, concerning slavery, the Lord said that if a Hebrew were to sell another Hebrew as property, then the person who sold them should be put to death. Number 6, a brother's duty to his widowed sister-in-law is established. After declaring that the limit for whipping an offender was to be capped at 40, the Lord explained that if a woman lost her husband, then it was the husband's brother's responsibility to take care of her and marry her as his own. If he refused, then he was to be brought to the elders, and they are to have him take off his shoes. They would spit in his face and spread his name all throughout Israel as a dishonorable man. Oh, and just for kicks and giggles, this chapter ends by explaining that if two men were in a fight, and the wife of one of the men grabbed the other by his stones, then her hand was to be cut off. And letter S, the first fruits offering was commanded upon entrance into the land. The people were to bring the offering to the priests and then recite to them a paraphrase of how they entered and their exodus out of Egypt. This was really another word for a tithe, and in addition to the regular tithe, this special tithe was to be repeated every 3 years. Roman numeral 3, the condition for the blessing in the land. Letter A, the law is commanded to be written in great stones after the entrance into Canaan. All the law was to be written on the stones, and then the priests were to recite all the things that made one cursed, and the people would say Amen after each one, kind of like a responsive reading. 12 things are listed, and 4 of the 12, or 1/3, pertained to sexual sins like bestiality, incest, and pornography. Then letter B, God promises Israel blessings for obeying his word and cursings for disobeying. This is a restating of Leviticus 26, where the Lord promised blessings like rain for the crops, abundance of crops, and peace in the land from animal and human if they obey the Lord. but promises of cursings like terror, sickness, fever, crop failure, and defeat in battle if they disobeyed him. As is seen in Leviticus chapter 26, much more is written about the cursings than the blessings. Then letter C, the word of the covenant is reiterated. This is literally a recap of God taking them out of Egypt, providing for them in the Exodus, and promising to bless them in the land of Canaan. And letter D, the rewards for turning back to God are detailed. If their disobedience resulted in cursings, then when they returned to the Lord, he would give their cursings to the enemy and bless them mightily. And finally, Roman numeral 4, Moses' parting counsel. Letter A, Moses encourages Joshua. Moses says that he is 120 years old, but can go no further with the people. So he tells them all that Joshua will now lead them over Jordan into the land. And then he encourages Joshua to be strong and have courage, because the Lord will be with them. Letter B, Moses commands the Levites to read the law every 7 years. Moses says that they are to assemble all the people, including the foreigners, and read the entire law before everyone. Letter C, God informs Moses and Joshua that Israel will turn away from him. God told Moses that he would die soon, so he needed to get Joshua and go to the tabernacle. While there, the Lord informed them both that the people would get into idolatry, thereby breaking the covenant with God. On account of this, the Lord will be angry and forsake them, allowing many evils to befall them. This causes the Lord to tell Moses to write a song about this, and Moses commanded that this book of the law that he had written be placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. Letter D, the Song of Moses is recorded. This song is a recap of all that God had done for them and all they had done against God. After singing this song with Joshua to the people, the Lord told Moses to go up to Mount Abarim, or Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab next to Jericho, so that he could see the land and then die. Interestingly, God says that when he dies, he would be gathered together with his people like his brother Aaron was. Now, this cannot be talking about a burial because he was not buried with any of his family. So this is most likely the first reference to the afterlife directly mentioned in the Old Testament. Then letter E, Moses blesses the children of Israel before his death. In his blessing, Moses calls each tribe by name and gives them each a specific blessing. And finally, letter F, God shows Moses the promised land, and he dies. Now this chapter was most likely written by Joshua, because in it we find out that Moses went up to the top of Pisgah on Mount Nebo, so the Lord could show him the land, and then he died. He was buried in the plains of Moab near Beth Peor, but no one knows exactly where. However, it doesn't really matter because according to Jude verse 6, Lucifer tried to take the bones of Moses, but Michael the archangel rebuked him in the name of the Lord and took them. What happened next with the bones? I believe that they might have been formed into his glorified body. This would be why Peter, James, and John saw both Moses and Elijah in physical form at the Mount of Transfiguration. Now, after Moses' death, the Bible records that the people mourned for 30 days. So that will bring us to our 10th and final lesson throughout the study of the Pentateuch.